Hello! So, I finally finished the third book of the Lunar Chronicles, and so now I can talk about it. Alright, so Lunar Chronicles, just a recap because it's been over 2 weeks now since the last time I talked about them. They are futuristic retellings of classic fairy tales. The first one was Cinder, and it was about Cinderella, obviously. The second one was Scarlet, which was more about Little Red Riding Hood, but it still incorporated the characters from the first book. These books are, genre-wise, they're part of YA, young adult fiction, fantasy fiction, science fiction, and utopian and dystopian fiction. So if you are interested in any of those types of books, I think you will really like specifically this book. This was probably my favorite of these, this series, I guess, so far. I actually am giving it a 4-star review out of 5. It was my favorite one. So Cress is a futuristic retelling of the story of Rapunzel. It still had those same characters and elements from Cinderella and Red Riding Hood, and it all just kind of brought everything together in a really cool way. The protagonists in this book, because there are a few of them, we still have Cinder and Scarlet, Wolf, Prince Kai, Thorn from the first 2 books, but we're introduced to a new character, and that character is Cress, who is the Rapunzel character. So, ways that it is the same as the classic fairy tale. Cress, the Rapunzel character, is stolen from her parents as a child and is locked away. She is only visited by her captor for the course of, I think they said it was like 16 years. No, she's 16 years old, so it was over the course of 7 years. Then she is rescued by a heroic character, and the hero character, like in the classic fairy tale, cuts off her long hair and eventually also goes blind and is forced to wander through a wasteland for a period of time. The original story of Rapunzel is a lot darker, I think, than most people really realize. It was a lot darker than I realized initially when I went back and kind of looked into it for this, because I didn't realize that the heroic character that comes in to rescue Rapunzel actually goes blind and it's then stranded in kind of a desert wasteland area searching for Rapunzel for years. In this book, it's not years, it's probably just like a couple of days, but at the same time, it's still that kind of twisted idea there. But then ways that it's different, I was actually surprised by how similar it was and how similar they managed to keep it to that classic fairy tale, but there are still parts that were different. And the parts that were different from the classic story of Rapunzel, pretty much anything that didn't revolve around Cress, because everything else was about the other fairy tale characters. So we still have all of the parts about Cinderella, all of the parts about Red Riding Hood, although that story is kind of overshadowed a little bit in this one, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Some things specifically about Cress and her character that were different in this book than the classic fairy tale. Cress is a hacker, and not just like any hacker. She's brilliant, and she's able to get into secure databases that anyone else, even like the best hackers in their world, aren't able to get into. She's just that good. And she also knows about the heroic character that comes to rescue her years before he actually comes to rescue her. So, I don't know. I like that they had that build up. She had this kind of idea in her head about the kind of person that he was before he comes in to save her. And then when she meets him, like she gets to see what he's actually like, and just the way she deals with that realization. But now getting into, without giving away spoilers, things that I didn't like and ending with things that I did. So some things that I didn't like about this book, there wasn't a whole lot from Scarlett's perspective, and up until reading this book, she was kind of my favorite character, and I just really liked seeing those feistier sides of the characters that always seemed to come out when Scarlett was around. So not having a lot of her in this book kind of, at the beginning, it kind of felt like it was taking away a little bit of the life from this story, but the more you get into it and the more you get to know the other characters and see how fleshed out they are in this one, it's easier to deal with. I wasn't as upset after a little while. But something else, the characters seem to figure things out almost too quickly and too easily. In this book, it's almost like they know more than they should, or they are almost superhumanly intelligent to make the connections that they do. They shouldn't be able to make some of the connections that they do in this book between like different information that they have. The third thing that I wasn't a huge fan of, the villains or like the evil people in this book don't really seem like a true threat, I guess. It's hard to explain because you know that they're a threat because there's a war in the background, and there's kind of been that ebbing of a war for the last 2 books. But in this book, you see a lot more of the villains, and you also see a little bit from their perspective. But at the same time, even when you're in their perspective, you don't really feel like they're a huge threat to the protagonists. Like, it just hasn't hit that point yet. So you almost aren't afraid of them necessarily. It's just they're there. They exist. It's not a huge plot point, I guess. Like, they're there and they should be threatening, but they're not. Along with that, I guess, the fight scenes in this book, because there are a lot more in this one than there really have been in the past, they don't really drive the plot that much. They just kind of happen, and then we move on. And the characters are a little bit affected by them. One specifically is pretty affected, but the rest just kind of are like, oh yeah, we got in a fight, that was fun. And then they move on. But the other characters, the last thing that I wasn't a huge fan of was some of the new characters that are introduced in this book don't really seem like they matter that much. They don't really have a place, I guess. They might become more important in the next book, because I know that there is a 4th book. I think that's the last one in the Lunar Chronicles. But there are a couple of characters that almost just seem like plot conveniences. They needed a new person that could fly their spacecraft, and so there just happened to be someone that was available to fly their spacecraft, but he doesn't really have a personality. He just kind of is there. Again, some of the random characters that are introduced in this book, they don't really have personalities. They aren't fully fleshed out. But that was just not my favorite part of the book. But with that being said, some things that were my favorite parts of the book, ending on a positive note. This was the first book out of the Lunar Chronicles that I've read so far that I actually was excited to pick back up after I put it down. I almost wanted to read it in one sitting. I didn't want to put it down because I was so finally engaged with the story that was happening. So that was really exciting. If it takes 3 books for me to actually be excited about the characters, maybe not the best thing, but we finally got there. Then the characters in this book, the ones that we've already been introduced to, characters like Cinder and Kai, they're finally fleshed out. You finally feel like they're real characters now. I know in the other books I had talked about how Kai just kind of seemed very bland and not really a relatable character. In this one, you finally get to see him have a personality and make concrete decisions and have some kind of backing for those decisions that he's making. And he starts to really show the person that he is, which I thought was cool. I really liked it. Um, Another thing that I liked about this book was just some of the relationships between the characters, specifically once Cress and Thorn meet, the relationship that they kind of build, even just starting as a friendship and the way that they interact with each other, because Cress has been on lockdown in like a kind of separate area of space. I don't want to give anything away, but she's locked away in a separate area of space. So when she finally gets to interact with people that aren't her captor, she's really innocent and naive. She really thinks the best of people. She doesn't realize a lot of the terrible things that could be happening. But Thorn has a really good way of interacting with her and bringing her into that without being a jerk about it and without being like overwhelming, I guess, about everything. Another thing that I really liked about this one was that we finally get to see the real stakes of everything. In this book, you start to see that the war isn't just in the background anymore. It is really starting to build towards being the main plot of the book, which I really like because I really like the high stakes plots. I like when there is a lot that could go wrong, and when you have a war, there's a lot that can go wrong. And especially with the characters that we have right now, and they don't really have a plan, and you kind of get to see them making all of these plans and then figuring out how that could go wrong, and just the way everything is set up there for the next book. It's really exciting, and I really like it. And the final thing that I really like, and this just might be a me preference kind of thing, I like when characters that have some kind of magical ability or some kind of like otherworldly powers aren't able to master them right away, or it's not easy. They have to keep practicing and getting better and growing in their abilities. And that's what they did with Cinder in this one. She knows that she has these abilities. She's working on it. You actually get to see her train and try and figure out everything that she can do. And she has moments where she's very, very powerful and she's able to do things. But then you also see the repercussions for those moments when she has like a big burst of that power and how it affects her and how it affects the people around her. But she isn't fully mastered in those skills. So it's really cool to kind of see her grow and see her character develop with that and see her kind of battling against how she feels about these abilities versus the fact that she knows she needs to use them in certain ways. So that is what I thought of this book, and I am going to hopefully be getting the next one soon. So thanks for listening.